Does prison work? Clearly it protects us from people who've shown a willingness to harm fellow citizens, and it acts as a deterrent to people who might be thinking about committing a crime. It's less successful in rehabilitation of offenders though, and Andrew Neilson from the Howard League from Penal Reform believes that in some cases more effective and lower cost alternatives are available. Andrew joins me now in the studio.
So the Howard League for Penal Reform is a very old charity. We think we're the oldest prison reform organisation in the world. We were founded in 1866 by admirers of a man called John Howard, who had actually lived in the century before that, the 18th century. He was High Sheriff of Bedfordshire, and while he was High Sheriff of Bedfordshire, he became interested in the local prisons, started to visit them, write about them. He was the first person to give evidence to Parliament in London about the state of prisons. And he ended up travelling Europe, visiting prisons. In fact, he eventually died in the Ukraine, in Kherson, visiting prisons. So we were founded by admirers of his the following century. And really, during the 20th century in particular, the Howard League was behind and leading campaigns on quite a lot of what we would say are kind of hallmark criminal justice reforms of the 20th century. So the abolition of capital and corporal punishment, hanging and flogging, the formation of the probation service, so services in the community, and also actually introducing services for victims who previously had not really been strangely recognised by the criminal justice system in really any way. So that's what we did for a lot of our history. And in more recent decades, and in the 17 odd years that I've worked at the Howard League, our big concern has been around the growth in the prison population in England and Wales, which is the jurisdiction we officially cover, and the impact of that growth on how prisons operate and their effectiveness. And we're still campaigning about that right now because it's a very topical issue in the news in the UK.
And indeed, in the Isle of Man too, we have similar issues. I mean, there's a general view, isn't there, that the best thing you can do with someone who's committed a crime is to throw them in jail, and that'll sort them out. But it doesn't tend to work that way, does it?
No, it doesn't. I mean, I think there are, of course, people who commit very serious crimes, and prison is the only sanction that is going to symbolise society's disapproval of that crime and is going to punish the person. But there are lots of people in prison who don't commit such serious crimes, who are often in prison for short periods because the crimes they're committing are not the most serious. And when you look at why they're committing that crime, you very quickly realise that there are a lot of problems in their life. And that could be, for example, that they have substance misuse issues, they got poor mental health, they maybe don't have a job, they maybe don't have a home, they may have histories of neglect and abuse in their family lives. Lots of things that do need attention, but the one institution that is unlikely to be able to help them is a prison, because prisons are primarily there to deprive you of your liberty. They're not hospitals, they're not schools. They can try and replicate some of those services, but it's never the priority for the prison. The priority is keeping somebody locked up. And so, unsurprisingly, many of the people that I'm describing leave prison and go on to reoffend, sometimes more severely or more frequently than they did before they went into prison. And that is a group of people that I think we could be doing a lot better for.
So, I mean, you say we could do a lot better. Well, what does a lot better look like? Because I'm guessing one of the reasons that people think that prison works is because it is a affordable option. We put people into prison and jobs are good, and whereas rehabilitation, or indeed working with people who may be offenders or may be about to offend. These sorts of things are a much more uncertain thing in as much as you could be working with someone for a year or two and then they still go and commit offences, or you're not entirely sure which people you need to be targeting as the most likely people to commit that offence. Presumably that all costs money, and the easiest option has always been, let's just put them in prison and that's solved our particular problem.
I mean, if you look at the cost of a prison place for a year and compare it to the cost of, say, putting someone on an intensive community order, the community order is actually cheaper. There's a lot of money that's just sunk into the bricks and mortar and keeping the maintenance of prisons going. Particularly when you have older prisons. I mean, I know that the Isle of Man used to have an old Victorian jail. We still have very many old Victorian jails in England, which are in a terrible state of disrepair, and a lot of money is just spent on trying to keep their heads above water. But community orders are about a tenth of the cost of a year in prison. And they are, in the end, targeted at the underlying causes of crime. So the sorts of activities that you would do on a community order will be things like drug treatment. So if that's part of the reason why you've been on a shoplifting spree or whatever it might be, or burglaries, then that is more likely to solve that problem than simply lying on a prison bunk doing nothing, which is often what happens in the prison system. Particularly, we find in our system in England and Wales, post the pandemic, prisons have really, pre-COVID, prisons had, to some degree, active regimes. People were out of their cells for a part of the day doing work or education. But during COVID, people were kept in their cells to halt the spread of the virus. And for a number of reasons, prisons have really struggled to get back out of that kind of very closed regime. So at the moment, partly because of that, partly because of the pressures of overcrowding, we are seeing prisons really offering very little in the way of rehabilitation, very little in the way of purposeful activity. People spending sometimes up to 23 hours a day locked in their cell doing nothing. And that really is a recipe for more crime, frankly, because most people in prison do get released. And if nothing positive has been done with them while they are in prison, and actually what they will experience, certainly in our prisons, is often high levels of violence. Drugs are freely available. Self-harm is very high. What they are experiencing is negative and is likely to make them, I think, more likely to reoffend rather than less.
So has there been any sort of study or consideration of statistics showing that there's been a difference since the effectively lockdowns from COVID? Have the figures effectively backed up what you're saying?
So we do have, reoffending rates are difficult to compare often over a long period of time because they keep changing the methodology of how you measure them. But certainly the reoffending rates for prison sentences are not good, and when you compare them to community orders, the reoffending rate is better. But of course, we have to recognise that sometimes you do have people who are going to prison because they've failed community orders. So I'm not suggesting that they're a magic bullet. They're not the only answer, but they certainly are an important part of the system, and we need to properly resource them. And one of the problems that we've seen in recent years is more and more money going into expanding the prison system, while the probation service in the community has struggled for funding. And that actually, I think, is a mistake, because ultimately crime occurs in the community. So you want the service that works in the community to be as well resourced as possible, because both in terms of operating these community orders that I mentioned, but also supervising people when they are released from prison if they're on a licence. The work probation does is really crucial. But unfortunately, what we've seen is the prison population growing and projected to grow at such a rate that just billions of pounds at the moment are being spent on building new prisons in a desperate attempt to create the capacity to to answer this kind of growing demand in prison numbers. And unfortunately, the government has run out of road, effectively. And so we have seen quite a change in policies in the last few months since the new Labour government was elected.
And I suppose the figures that really do paint a quite a stark picture are the fact that the prison population per head in the UK is quite significant compared with most of the surrounding countries in Europe. Yes,
so we have I can say, that at the moment, last week, there were almost 86,000 people in prison in England and Wales, for example. And that might sound like a big number, it might sound like a small number. How do you compare? Well, we do have a way of comparing. And when I talk to the Positive Action Group, I'm going to be talking about this very point. There's something that we call a prison population rate. And you can compare jurisdictions by looking at how many people are in the general population and then how many people are in the prison population. And for every 100,000 people in the general population, how many prisoners are there? So for England and Wales, for example, the last prison population rate that was calculated said there was 145 prisoners per 100,000 of the population. And in Scotland, it was 143. But in Northern Ireland, it was 97. In France, it was 109. Germany, 67, so considerably less. And then when we look at somewhere like Norway, it's as low as 52. So other countries, certainly in Western Europe, do jail less people than we tend to see in the UK. We are not at the same time using prison as profligately as the Americans do, where 531 is the prison population rate. And one of the things that I was doing in preparation for my trip here was thinking about, well, what would be the prison population rate for the Isle of Man? Of course, there aren't 100,000 people living on the Isle of Man, but if you take the last census, and it's about 84,500 people, and you need about another 18% of a population to get to 100,000. So I thought, well, let's say how many people were in prison at the last inspection report and add 18% to that, and that will give you some idea of what the prison population rate for the Isle of Man is. Well, there were 132 people in the Isle of Man prison when inspectors visited in the summer. And if you increase that by 18%, it's actually 156, which is higher than England and Wales, which surprised me.
Yeah. And I'm sure would surprise a lot of listeners, because we would assume that the Isle of Man is a relatively safe place. Well, that's certainly what the Isle of Man government regularly says about the Isle of Man. Relatively safe place and relatively low crime area. So that's quite a dramatic figure.
Yeah, it did surprise me. I mean, I suspect that it may be related to drug smuggling, and some of the people in the prison may not be from the Isle of Man. They may indeed be from England. But nonetheless, I think it should, it should make people think. Because, as I say, England and Wales is seen as an outlier in Western Europe for a prison population rate of 145. But yeah, based on the last inspection report, when there were 132 prisoners in the Isle of Man prison, that would suggest a higher rate, 156 would be what we'd be looking at.
You mentioned as well there the American figures, and there is recently in the news there was the story about the situation in Texas, which is probably not known for being a kind of a liberal centre-left type jurisdiction that might have a more enlightened view to prison, but there's been some significant work ongoing there, which does seem to be more about what you're talking about, which is helping people to not to reoffend, helping people to stay out of prison.
Yes, so Texas is interesting because, and I think it's often the politicians who are interested in prison reform are interested in the Texas example because it's a Republican state, and it was a prison reform led by Republican politicians who are traditionally obviously seen as right-wing. it had very similar capacity challenges to the challenges that are faced in England and Wales at the moment. In 2007, prisons in Texas were at capacity. The population was predicted to rise to the extent that they would need an additional 17,000 cells over a 5-year period, which would be almost impossible, just even if you had the money to build them quickly enough. And so the Republican governor at the time introduced a system where prisoners could reduce the time that they spent in custody by participating in courses that would be aimed at tackling why they committed crime and for behaving well. And through that, they were able to decrease the prison population by over 20,000 people. And crime fell at the same time in that period. So Texas is seen as an example, and it's certainly an example that the Labour government in London is looking at as they wrestle with similar issues.
So then, we've heard there about the situation in Texas, where they've significantly reduced prison numbers. What does Norway do? Because you mentioned that their ratio was substantially lower than the UK's.
Well, interestingly, when you look at countries with very low prison populations, and you look at the countries with very high prison populations. So Norway, I mentioned, has a prison population rate of 52 per 100,000. America has a prison population rate of 531 per 100,000. The thing that's interesting that you can also see in those two jurisdictions is that Norway has a very advanced social welfare system, and America does not have much in the way of a social welfare system. And that tells you something, which is that actually a lot of the answers to crime don't lie in the criminal justice system. They lie in having good public services that pick up social problems early on, so people don't end up becoming adults who commit crime. And I think that's what Norway does well. You can look at the Norwegian prison system, and it's true because it's a very small system, they are also able to do things that I think would be very difficult to do in England. So, for example, prison officers in Norway are degree trained in being prison officers. It's an academic degree with a year of practice experience of being a prison officer as part of the degree. 2 or 3 years, I think now, the degree lasts. And that means that their prison officers are, they have a level of training that we don't offer in the UK, and they are very much rehabilitation focused in what they do. But they're able to do that because they've kept their system small, and so they can invest money in that kind of way. They're not having to spend all their money in just building new prisons, which is the problem that we have in the UK.
And this is an interesting thought, though. I hadn't really thought of this before. So what training do prison officers in the UK, and I presume in the Isle of Man, what sort of training do they get?
10 weeks.
Gosh.
So, several years compared to 10 weeks. And the only mandatory bit of training is in physically restraining somebody. Whereas part of the training in Norway will involve how you have conversations with people in order to get them to divulge some of the issues that they've been facing, so that you can attempt to steer them into whatever treatment or whatever that might be best placed for them, to hopefully mean that they sort themselves out and they don't commit crime. Now, that kind of stuff does happen. Obviously, there are good prison officers in the UK and the Isle of Man, I'm sure, who do that instinctively. But it's built in and baked into the Norwegian system in that degree training that I mentioned.
And I suppose we wouldn't expect people to go into a classroom and teach with 10 weeks training. We would hope that they would have at least a year of tertiary education under their belt in terms of teaching children, and I'm guessing the skills required in teaching adults or helping adults that have been conditioned into behaving in a particular way, getting them persuaded to change their thinking, that would probably have a similar level of complexity associated with it to teaching kids.
Absolutely. And as I say, there are prison officers who are good at their jobs, and they are good at instinctively knowing how to have those conversations with people and try and help them. But it certainly isn't something that they are being helped to do by the training that they receive. Or indeed really what the system primarily prioritises. The primary priority in the end is security before anything else. And the more overcrowded a system is, as we have in England, the more that's the case.
And then I suppose in terms of the Manx position, the position in the Isle of Man, what things would you recommend if you had the opportunity to speak to the Home Affairs Minister? What things would you recommend that they do to improve things?
Well, I would always recommend looking at the balance of spend between prisons and the probation service in the community, because I do think that a well-funded, well-structured probation service is really key, and it's often forgotten about. Because prisons are they occupy a space in the public imagination in a way that probation, which is a sort of invisible service, doesn't occupy that same space. But I do think it's key, because it's key to keeping people out of prison in terms of community orders, but it's also key to helping people when they leave prison in terms of supporting them, particularly if they're on a licence, being supervised in the community. If we look at, the Isle of Man prison has had some critical reports in recent years. They are nowhere near, though, as critical as what the Chief Inspector of Prisons is saying about prisons in England. There are some concerns. For example, there's been a run of self-inflicted deaths. That's very concerning. To have 3 in such a small population is a worry. But when we look at what Charlie Taylor, the Chief Inspector of Prisons, has been saying about English prisons, he's talking about squalor, he's talking about brutalising conditions. That is not the language that he's used here. So that's good. There is, of course, more that can be done, and I know that ministers are looking to see improvements in the prison because of the inspection reports it's received. There's definitely more that could be done to prepare people for employment on release and addressing the reasons why they've offended. But again, I think that is pretty typical of prisons everywhere, because as I mentioned earlier, prisons are primarily about detaining people. Rehabilitation is often a very distant second to that.
And I suppose the final question then, you came to the Isle of Man 15 years ago. You were relatively fresh-faced and new in your role with the Howard League, and presumably full of enthusiasm and clarity that things were just about to change. Is it difficult when you see what I'm guessing you would see as the blindingly obvious not being done across the whole prison probation service in the UK?
15 years ago, the new prison had just been built, and I did say then that don't think that a new building will solve all your problems. And I think in that sense, you look at some of the issues that have been highlighted in inspection reports, and I would say I've been vindicated in that. When I think about the UK and my day-to-day work, it has certainly been very frustrating over many years, and successive governments have, I would say, buried their head in the sand and built their way towards the capacity crisis that hit the headlines over the summer, where they have literally run out of prison cells. That said, we now have a sentencing review that's been announced in the UK, and prison reform seems to be on the agenda in a way that it never has in my time working in the field. So that at least keeps me energised, if not quite as enthusiastic as I might have been 15 years ago.
And the expectation that 15 years' time, in 15 years into the future, would you expect that we'll see a dramatic and radical improvement?
I do think that in England, the government will move away from the trajectory we've gone on for the last 30 years, which is one of ever-increasing prison populations. That is no longer tenable. The Justice Secretary said that if they were to... prison numbers are projected to rise by something like 30% over the next 5 to 10 years. And in order to meet that kind of growth, the government would have to build 2 or 3 mega jails a year. This was something that the Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, said in Parliament. When I say mega jails, we're talking prisons many, many times the size of the Isle of Man prison. Prisons that would hold 2,000 to 2,500 people in them each. Well, once you get to that stage, you are saying, if we're going to do that, then we can't spend money on schools. We can't spend money on hospitals. There are hard choices that would have to be made to make that even remotely tenable. So we are going to see a move away from that. I think we are going to hopefully see some more progressive policies. We will see prison used more sparingly, but it will be used, and it will be, of course, focused on the people who commit the most serious and violent crime. And what I'm hoping we see, as I've mentioned before, is that we see investment in the probation service in the community, and generally in preventative services that can stop crime before it happens.
That was Andrew Neilson from the Howard League for Penal Reform, who spoke last month at a Positive Action Group meeting. So what do you think? Lock them up and throw away the key, or try to help offenders move away from their destructive behaviours through other means? Perhaps a mix of the two. Let me know your thoughts by contacting Phil Gaughan at manxradio.com, and get in touch if you have any ideas for future shows. Don't forget, this programme is available as a podcast on Manx Radio's website. For now though, I'm Phil Gaughan. Goramayo, thanks for listening.